Just as failure rule number 5, you are not your failures, is true, it is also true that you are not your moral failures. This doesn't mean that you won't have to deal with the ramifications of your moral failures. It doesn't mean that you won't suffer as a result of some of the outcomes of your moral failures. But it does mean that they don't need to define you unless you let them. It does mean that you can be transformed and reclaim your life and leave those moral failures behind you. Just as failure rule number 1, failure purifies, is true, it is also true that moral failure purifies you. And when it does, it can often help birth a much better next version of you. In the TV show Better Call Saul, the eccentric, morally flexible attorney Jimmy McGill, who later changes his name to Saul Goodman, made the bold decision to listen to the pounding sound of his internal spirit voice. Jimmy had crawled his way from the mailroom of his brother's firm up to a job working in a prestigious firm, Davis in Maine. At first, Jimmy seemed to take the new life in stride. He enjoyed the fringe benefit trappings of a company car, a high-end apartment, an assistant, a swanky office, and nice bonuses. It seemed that he had landed, that the hard work had paid off, that he was finally enjoying the ripe, juicy fruit borne by years of arduous struggle. Yet deep inside, Jimmy was disturbingly unsettled in this new life. On paper, and from the outside looking in, it seemed perfect, comfortable, luxurious, sophisticated, prestigious, and full of future brightness. But Jimmy's authentic self, characterized by his theatric charisma, his clever creativity, and his unorthodox ingenuity, wasn't welcome at Davis in Maine. So Jimmy had the choice to either suppress his authentic self in exchange for comfort and security, or to embrace his authentic self and go out on his own, accepting all the risk of instability that choice would entail. Jimmy boldly chose to embrace his authentic self and leave Davis in Maine. This allowed all of Jimmy's authentic talents and personality manifestations to be fully employed in the persona of Saul Goodman. Unfortunately, being your authentic self and being ethical are not the same thing. You can be one without the other. In Jimmy's embracing of his authentic being, wrapped up in his new persona as Saul Goodman, he failed to also embrace ethical pursuits. As the story goes, Jimmy's authentic self was sadly misapplied toward negative and criminal engagements. Now, there's much to admire about the story of Jimmy McGill. Jimmy was more than his moral failures, but he also never turned from his moral failures. This was his greatest failure. But there are many others who are not only not defined by their moral failures, but who have decisively turned away from them to become better next versions of themselves. So let's take a look at some of those. Anti-racist activist Christian Picciolini has led a wild life. He has journeyed from being an abhorrent hater to a passionate and compassionate healer. You see, Christian was one of the prime movers in the early American white power skinhead movement in the 80s and 90s. Hate ran through his veins. Violence was a way of life. As the years went on, Christian began to reevaluate his toxic beliefs, his violent lifestyle, and his place in this world. And he eventually decided to walk away from hate. But he didn't just quietly walk away from hate. No. Instead, he began to organize to lead others out of hate and to prevent them from being seduced by it in the first place. First, Christian led the Free Radicals Project, a global extremism prevention and disengagement network in which he helped hundreds of individuals leave hate behind. Then, he went on to write 2 books, Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism, and White American Youth. Both books help evangelize the value of Christian's redemptive path out of a life of hate. When Christian turned away from hate, he had the wisdom to know that he was not his moral failures. Because he knew this, he was able to accept failure rule number 1, failure purifies, and painfully shed the debris of his past life. In that cleansing, Christian's next self emerged to bring hope, redemption, and practical forgiveness to many looking for a way out of the hate trap they had found themselves in. Christian's life is now 100% focused on reversing and preventing the very hate he had once embraced. Screenwriter Elgin James once played guitar in a hardcore punk band with retired Navy SEAL Jocko Willink. In a former life, Elgin was also the founder of the street gang FSU, which was equally known to mean fuck shit up, along with Friends Stand United. FSU had in its unofficial mission statement a goal to target drug dealers, drug users, and white power skinheads for violence. Throughout punk shows across the US, FSU became a feared presence that initiated violence wherever they went, often indiscriminately despite their stated goals. They had chapters in Philadelphia, upstate New York, and many other cities extending out from the founding city of Boston. FSU's notoriety went on to be documented in Rolling Stone magazine and an episode of the TV show Gangland on the History Channel. Elgin's activity as a leader of FSU was a moral failure. FSU ended up causing Elgin to be punished both for his sins and by them. In 2009, he was arrested on extortion charges involving an incident with a member of the punk band Mest. In 2011, he was sentenced to a little over a year in prison. At sentencing, Elgin said, "The last few months have been a juxtaposition juxtaposition of the best and worst of my life. Today I faced my day of reckoning. I've accepted responsibility for my past. The juxtaposition Elgin referenced was profound. For years leading up to his sentencing, Elgin had done the hard soul-searching necessary to rebuild a failed life and align with his unique calling journey. Elgin had publicly distanced himself from FSU and violence. He and his girlfriend jettisoned the Northeast and moved to Los Angeles so Elgin could pursue the core of his calling journey: screenwriting. In the ashes of a stained reputation attached to gang life, Elgin heard the internal spirit voice calling him to screenwriting. It was on the day of his sentencing that the contrast of his old life and new life was the most evident, because it was on his day of sentencing that Elgin was also hired to write a screenplay for Brian Grazer and Universal Pictures. His new life was also a contrasting display at sentencing through the support of his new Hollywood mentors. Among many other letters written to the judge, actors Ed Harris and Robert Redford penned messages of support for Elgin, noting the transformation that had taken place in his life. Redford, who Elgin specifically cites as being instrumental in helping him turn from violence, wrote the following about him: "I believe that Elgin has the potential to make a difference. He has an important message for people of all ages on the possibility of change and the power of non-violence." Elgin endured his earned prison time and continued to dig deep on honing his unique screenwriting skill. He went on to give the world what few others could by bringing to life projects such as the film Lowriders and the TV series Mayans MC, the highly anticipated spin-off to FX's hit show Sons of Anarchy. Elgin James knows the power of failure rule number 5. You are not your failures. And because he knows that failure rule number 5 also extends to moral failures, he was able to embrace redemption and rebuild his life to offer the world, through his screenwriting, what only could uniquely be given by him. Sports journalist and podcaster Jason Whitlock used to love going to strip clubs. The former Outkick and ESPN columnist talks about this extensively on his new show called Fearless, which airs on the Blaze TV network. Whitlock, who now embraces Christianity, openly shares with his audience what he describes as his own moral failings in controlling his lust. He describes in detail the frequency with which he would visit strip clubs, the enthusiasm in which he would celebrate their existence, and the pleasure he got out of being a regular in multiple clubs across the country as he traveled. Whitlock is open about this part of his life because he knows that he is not his moral failures. Whitlock no longer acts on his impulses to go to strip clubs due to his renewed focus on his Christian faith. It is his Christian faith that he credits as the antidote of his moral failures and paradoxically the explanation of their existence. He explains, "My sin doesn't nullify my Christianity, it justifies it." Whitlock believes that moral failures are part of the human condition and embracing faith is the way to mitigate and minimize them. For Whitlock, failure rule number 5, you are not your failures, is codified deep within his belief system. Moral failures not excluded. Legendary bodybuilder Dorian "The Shadow" Yates was once a teenage non-racist skinhead street urchin spreading hooliganism with his blokes on the streets of Britain. During the widespread unrest in large Britain cities during the summer of 1981, Dorian was walking the streets with his skinhead friends when one of his buddies got caught up in the riot spirit of the time. His friend busted a store window to steal a mannequin. The result was that Dorian and his mates were locked up in a rough juvenile detention center for a 6-month sentence. With his mom already having, for all intents and purposes, up and left him when he was 16, at 19, Dorian was now jammed up in the system. Instead of succumbing to the failure mindset of an ascendant criminal, Dorian instead began to embrace the discipline of weightlifting while in lockup. He began to see a vision for himself in which his unique strength could be harnessed into something great. Dorian Yates knew that he was not his moral failures. He knew that he could reinvent himself and strive for his best self even as he embraced the consequences of his moral failures. With good behavior, he was out in 3 months. He then hyper-focused his entire life around the bodybuilding ambitions that he had cultivated while in lockup. Dorian went on to win Mr. Olympia 6 consecutive times between 1992 and 1997. You can read more about his amazing life story in his biography, From the Shadow. If you're wallowing in a stuck state of self-hatred, pity, and regret over your moral failings, know that this is not your only choice. While you have to face the reality of any consequences and messiness that your moral failings may have hoisted into your life, you don't have to define yourself by any of it. You have the power to separate what you've done from who you are and can be, as long as you are determined to transform and move forward into your next best self with earnest. Let failure rule number 5, you are not your failures, help heal you as you work to mobilize your redemption story, because you are not your moral failures either.
Because you're young, you're torn between